All right. So on Friday of last week, we did a little overview of colonialism. And so, just as a quick reminder, we talked about how colonialism in human geography, we're going to be taking the approach of taking a look at how colonialism shaped the political boundaries of today's world. And that will be a big focus of our week this week. How did colonialism lead to the diffusion of language, religion, and other aspects of society? So hopefully on Friday you were able to take a look at that political or that colonial map and understand things like, oh, well, the Spanish um, had a lot of influence in Latin America, or they colonized, Mexico, for example, and today those regions of the world speak Spanish. Or when the English colonized North America, they had some influence in the diffusion of English to that part of the world. We are going to focus on the continent of Africa and colonization in Africa today, but we will kind of stick with some of these themes. And then the last one is, how did colonialism shape the economic structure of today's world? So all of those is how we take a look at colonialism in human geography. Once again, you're going to get a lot more information about colonialism in world history next year. So we're going to skip forward through a lot of the stuff that we talked about last week. I'm going to go kind of quickly through here. And if we were in class, I'm going to stop here. If we're in class, I would start out today by showing you guys this picture. And so I always start with this when we talk about the Berlin Conference and colonization of Africa. And you're taking a look at a picture, and I would just ask you, what do you notice in this picture? What do you think might be happening or not happening in this picture? So just take a second to take a look at this picture. And then I would ask for students to talk about what do they notice. And so students generally say things like, oh, I notice people all in a big, conference hall. They're all discussing something. They're meeting about something. I notice that they're all dressed very nicely. I notice that they're all men. I notice that they're all white men. And I also notice that there is a large mural of Africa, or a large map of Africa, in the background. So when we talk about what do you think might be happening or not happening, this meeting is a rendition of something called the Berlin Conference. So the Berlin Conference happened in 1884 to 1885 in Berlin, Germany. But the meeting was between European powers in order to decide how to divide up Africa amongst the European countries and how to divide up Africa into colonies. And so we would also notice that, as I kind of already mentioned, that this is a conference about the fate of Africa, yet there's no African representatives, there's no leadership, there's no leaders, there's no representation from any of the African civilizations that are African people. And so obviously the interests and their own voices were never heard. So when we talk about Africa, we need to understand that Africa is a continent of extreme diversity. First of all, it's a continent of extreme wealth and resources, but extreme diversity as well. And so this is a map of the ethnic groups of Africa. And you notice that there is a lot of lines on this map. There's a lot of boundaries between different nations or between different ethnic groups that are not the same boundaries that we would see on Africa today, especially in a region. So over here, like in what is current day Nigeria, there's a lot of linguistic, a lot of ethnic diversity, and a lot of religious diversity as well. And this is important because when we take a look at this, the lines that we see in Africa today do not really represent the people of Africa. And part of that is due to the fact that it was divided up amongst people who didn't know the people of Africa, who didn't know or really potentially care about the ethnic differences or the ethnic conflicts that already existed or the language differences within Africa. So just as a quick little overview of the colonization of Africa, in the 1450s, Europeans had started to establish contact, more and more contact with Africa. There had always been trade across the Mediterranean and across Europe, Asia, and Africa. But in the 1450s, there was very little control of territory. By the 1500s, though, as Spain and Portugal and eventually the British and the French started to colonize America, the Americas, North and South America, they're looking for a labor force on the plantations, on the they're looking for a labor force in the Americas. Originally, the labor force was going to consist of the indigenous Americans. However, because of diseases brought over by Europeans and because of a lot of the resistance and conflict, the indigenous population was decimated to the point where they were not going to serve as a cheap labor force. So the Europeans in America started to look to Africa for slaves. And so once again, the transatlantic slave trade was the most devastating slave trade, or the most devastating forced migration in all of human history. It took millions of Africans out of their homeland and across the ocean to the Americas. Many died upon the journey. And if you think about, first of all, just what it did to the economy of African empires during that time, you're taking the most the best and the brightest and the strongest men and women across the ocean, and it really devastated Africa. And then by the 1800s, the Industrial Revolution, which began in Europe, starts to, oops, I do not want to make peanut butter bread, or at least not right now, looks good though. The Industrial Revolution, which was manufacturing, the beginning of kind of manufacturing, sparked the search for raw materials and new markets in the interior of Africa. And with that, Europeans got really interested in the raw materials and the wealth in raw materials in Africa. And by that point, superior European technology and African disunity made it possible to conquer many parts of Africa. So the European powers were all in kind of conflict over who had what in Africa. And so in 1884 to 1885, they held a conference to determine who was going to have control. So they did it in order to negotiate and end confusion over who had control of Africa. There were 14 mostly European nations, 14 mostly European, because the United States did have a representative at the Berlin Conference. However, the United States never did colonize any parts of Africa, and Africans themselves were never consulted. One of the results of the conference was, or one of the major results of the conference, was that Africa was haphazardly decided how to split up Africa without any concern for the ethnic groups or African interests that were already there. So this was the map. This is a map of Africa in the colonial Africa in 1914, but this map was really created at that conference. And so you can see that France had much control in West Africa. Britain had control north to south, South Africa, Egypt, Sudan. You can see that Spain and the British had Somalia, or parts of Somalia. Eritrea was Italian. Libya was Italian. And the Portuguese had some land down here. So a couple of quick results. So for example, in Nigeria, which is a British colony, one of the official languages of Nigeria today is still English. Although there are over 500 languages spoken in Nigeria, English is the official language of Nigeria, and that just shows the power that the colonial colonization still has on that country. And a lot of West Africans today still learn French as one of their languages that they learn in school. And so here's just a couple political cartoons. I'm going to go just this mad scramble for Africa. This is Otto von Bismarck of Germany dividing up Africa amongst the powers of Europe. And the results were that a hodgepodge of geometric boundaries that divided up Africa into 50 irregular countries or colonies. Boundaries were superimposed over the 1,000 indigenous cultures, meaning that they were just placed on the people. They lacked a whole lot of rhyme or reason. They divided some ethnic groups while merging others. They created multinational states amongst groups of people that did not maybe get along with each other. They created multi-state nations, which means that an ethnic group might have been divided amongst different countries. And they also created several landlocked states a country that is totally surrounded by land that does not have access to water. So once again, our ethnic map of Africa does not look like the divisions that were actually there. You can see from 1880 to 1913 how colonization spread through Africa. Ethiopia did remain independent, and they successfully fought off European colonization as one of the examples of extreme resistance to European powers. All right. So that's a long-winded explanation. Take a look at the other videos and answer discussion post for today.